Good evening, everybody. We'll get started in just a couple minutes.
Good evening. Well, let me get a video. Oh, I have no video. Oh, started.
There you are. Emilio. All right, it is 5 p.m. Like the nice lady just told us, this meeting is being recorded as well as live streamed on YouTube. And please remember to raise your hands before speaking, just so we can be careful of crosstalk. With that, Danny is our chair this evening. Please, Danny.
Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. And I want to thank everyone again for coming to tonight's meeting, and for any community members who are tuning in via YouTube, welcome. I'd like to kick us off by starting, as we always do, with a centering exercise. I'm going to read a statement guiding us in this exercise, and then I'll ask you all to follow along with me in this breathing exercise to bring focus and thoughtfulness to our conversation tonight. So let us begin. Today, we're going to convene to listen and learn from each other through reflection and discussion. As we reevaluate and improve our public safety practices, we elevate the voices and experiences of the communities who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by inequitable systems. We thank all of those who have advocated and worked on dismantling injustices in Tigard and our broader community. We build off their efforts to create more equitable and just outcomes for people of all backgrounds and identities. The purpose of our meeting tonight is to develop understanding of current public safety structure, practices, and procedures, identify and eliminate institutional racism within Tigard's public institutions by centering equity and racial justice, to bring forward the concerns and experiences of ourselves and our community, and to bring recommendations to our city's leadership. So we're gonna do the breathing exercise now, and you may turn off your camera at this point. Invite everybody to close their eyes and gaze softly downward. Feel the chair under your legs. Take a deep breath in through your nose and out of your mouth. Feel your hands in your lap. Breathe in deeply again through your nose and out through your mouth. Feel your feet on the ground. Again, breathe in deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Slowly open your eyes and begin to breathe normally. Thank you all for participating in this exercise and creating space with me. Kim, would you kick us off with our roll call?
Yes, thanks, Danny. Commander McDonald.
Here.
Officer Nunn.
Here.
Shelby Rahala.
Here.
Michael O'Brien.
Here.
Elise Butera. Emilio Calderon.
Here.
Liz won't be joining us this evening. John Trin.
Here.
Jimmy Brown.
You.
Lee Landers. Patty Lofgren.
I'm here.
Justin Love.
Here.
Danny Rauda.
Here.
Valerie Sasaki. Here. Sean won't be joining us this evening. Nick Jarmer.
Here, thank you.
And Jeff Mott.
Here.
And that is roll.
Thank you, Kim. We're now going to transition to our public comment segment of our meeting. Was there anybody who signed up or submitted written testimony?
There was no public comment.
All right. Well, we do hope for anybody tuning in and watching this video live or later that you do consider contributing and participating in tonight's session. Tonight, although there's no community members who have joined us to speak, we extend that invitation once more. Your opinions as the public are vital to the board's mission, and we welcome community feedback on our work. If you have comments for the board, written testimony must be written by 4:30 p.m. the day of the scheduled meeting, which is today on Mondays. If you'd like to speak at our meeting, please email our staff at the email address presented on the screen. There it is. So I'll now pass it over to Chief McAlpine for her chief's update.
Thank you, Danny. I believe all of you received a copy of the press release that went out on Friday, just advising the public that we had completed our internal review of the officer-involved shooting by convening our use of force board. While it was ruled within policy, as the policies were in place, there was also some training recommendations that have come out of this. And so our next step is to convene our subject matter experts and to look at those training opportunities. So again, this went out to all department members, to the council, city manager, and then to all of you ahead of time, and then obviously to the public. So that is our next steps regarding that. Then Kim, am I just going into my presentation? I can't, with the agenda, or is that a little bit later?
That's a little bit later. We were going to do the commander and Officer Nunn's presentation first.
Perfect, thank you.
Great.
Well, does anybody have any thoughts or comments on the chief's update?
Yes, Nick has his hand up. Nick Jarmer has his hand up.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Chief, for the letter. I got it. I was looking at it earlier this weekend, this past weekend. I just want to ask, the sentence says the board was comprised of 5 individuals, including a representative from outside police agency. My question is the board the same 5 people as opposed to the one outside person that you rotate? That's all I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Sure. By our policy, they're actually, it's really broken up by their job assignment. So that can vary depending. And then the outside individual, we opted, it doesn't designate specifically, do they come with a certain expertise? But the individual we asked is a subject matter expert in use of force, does a lot of training locally and nationally, and is certified in, I think, force science. So we really wanted to get his opinion and his input on this. In fact, that's portion of the delay, was working on his schedule to get him available in that December timeframe. And then we can, if you want me to take a couple minutes, I can have Commander McDonald just tell you the disciplines that make up the board if you guys desire that information. Okay, Jamie, would you like to go ahead and do that breakdown?
Yeah, sure. So by our policy, and this is a policy that's been in place for quite some time, it delineates the different people that will be involved in a use of force review board. So, for example, it has a subject matter expert from within the department who is within the discipline for the force that was applied. So, firearms in this case. We had a supervisor that is in the same division, but not in the same span of control of those that were involved in the incident. And then an administrator, so a lieutenant, who was uninvolved in the incident, who was also a part of that. The association, well, it's called a peer officer. So an officer of a similar, ideally a similar tenure, but basically of the same rank. So the union was able to select a person that they felt would be a subject matter expert in that area. And then that person was also a part of the board. And then, like the chief said, the outside subject matter expert from the outside agency was the fifth member. And that's all defined by policy in our policy as to what the construct of the board would look like when one of those is convened.
All right. Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Any other questions or comments for the chief? Okay.
Well, we are going to move on then and try to reserve the remaining time for our presentation for tonight and discussion, beginning with a TPOA collective bargaining agreement with Commander McDonald and Officer Nunn. So, Commander, Officer, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, Danny. So when Nick Nunn, so we don't get the two Nicks confused, when Nick Nunn and I were talking about this and bringing these ideas to the board tonight, one of the things we want to do is make this interactive as we're talking about this. So Kim or Tammy, one of the two, I don't remember which, sent you all the Article 27, which is directly out of the TPOA. So TPOA is the Tigard Police Officers Association. That's the collective bargaining unit or the union that represents the men and women that are covered under. So basically the officers that are working on the front lines. Our sergeants are not a part of the union. So once you get promoted in our organization, you're no longer part of the union. So the contract no longer applies. But Article 27 and then Addendum B are the two parts that most specifically address discipline or the disciplinary process that we have in the Tigard Police Department. So at a high level, discipline, or what triggers the disciplinary process, is when the violation or the alleged violation could result in basically a financial sanction, up to and including termination, right? If it's less than that, where let's say it is a service-oriented complaint, maybe an officer was curt with someone, or they were rude, but the rudeness doesn't necessarily rise to the level of something where they would be disciplined. Maybe they're going to get a letter of corrective counseling and sit down and come up with something with their supervisor, their direct supervisor, to address that type of behavior. And it's the first time it's ever happened. That wouldn't trigger the discipline process. If we have a reason to believe that the alleged action could result in discipline, then there's several triggers that happen. So anybody that is accused of something like that could result in a financial sanction or discipline as defined in the policies as well as the contract, is afforded a due process right. And there's plenty of case law up to the Supreme Court level that dictates how we as management can handle these investigative actions. So some of you may have looked through and some of the triggers that like, let's say in Addendum B, one of the very first things that it says is that we have to give notice to the employee before they can be interviewed. They have to have a 24-hour notice. They have to be afforded the opportunity to have representation. They need to know what it is they're being accused of having done. right? So they are afforded certain rights that we have to make sure that we follow as a part of the investigation. Now, one of the things that we know, and Nick and I work very closely together when these types of things come up, is that, we really don't have anything to hide in these things. These types of allegations are not generally a surprise when they come up. The person that is being accused is almost always 100% aware of what's going on, or at least their version of it. And our responsibility, as well as our desire, is to figure out exactly what happened, and staying within those lanes. Because, and I think, Nick, I think you'll agree with me when I say this, but the last thing that any of us want is an officer operating in that capacity when they shouldn't be. So we are very conscious about making sure that we hold people accountable when they've stepped out of line, when it's appropriate. We talked about the discipline matrix or the pyramid, right? That Commander Rogers showed a few weeks ago, or a couple weeks ago. And that is specifically born out of some of the language that you'll see at the very end of Addendum B. It was actually an excellent collaboration between the union and the city. And that's a perfect example of the union working with the city, or working with management, to make our process better, to make it better informed, to make it clearer to everybody, to the community, to the officers that will be held to that standard, as well as to making it consistent and predictable, because consistent and predictable discipline is what we want to be doing, right? If you do this, then this. And then there can always be aggravating and mitigating factors, as we learned from looking at that pyramid a couple of weeks ago. So specifically, when you're talking about the contract, it's relatively simple, right? Article 27 is 3 paragraphs long. It's very simple. It's basically is talking about what the process will be, the fact that you're going to get you're going to be afforded the opportunity to have a representative. And then in the addendum, it talks about, it gives guidelines for what the interview would look like. It gives guidelines and creates clarity for the amount of time that we can do those interviews, with or without a break, and things like that. So we're trying to be as transparent as possible when we do these investigations. But there's a set of guidelines that we have to work within. So I guess what I'd like to do is, well, first, Nick, do you have anything else you'd like to add about basically process in terms of how it relates to the contract itself?
No, I think you covered it. I think one important thing to note is I can't think of a law enforcement agency in the state of Oregon, and definitely not in Washington County, that doesn't have an association and that doesn't do very similar, if not almost the exact same procedure that we do. So this isn't out of the ordinary. This is a pretty standard process. And I think by having a representative, we're not trying to necessarily get officers out of trouble. We're making sure that this contract is followed, and we're another eyes and ears. So I think that's the only thing I really had to cover. I think you covered it pretty good.
Yeah, one of the things when we talk about like due process for employees, as a supervisor, I've been to plenty of training that specifically covers the topic of due process for employees and employment law and things like that. The association leadership does the same thing. and they go to training. In fact, we've been to some trainings together, and I think that it's important for us to have a clear understanding of what each side is, what their understanding of the process is, to make sure that we all have a clear understanding of what to expect from each other in these disciplinary processes. Fortunately, at Tigard, we don't see very many of these. We don't see very many high level, or serious investigations. Most of them are pretty simple. They're more along the lines of simple rules violations. They're not, we're not talking about misconduct. That's very rare here in Tigard. And part of that is because of the way we hire. We talked about our hiring process, and it's a direct result of the fact that we hire very high quality people. So we have very few misconduct issues in this agency. And I'll say, really that shift started probably back in about 2004 when Chief Bill Dickinson came in, and we really revamped a lot of our policy manual. We revamped, we really revamped how the discipline process was handled at that time. And it really professionalized the department. It put us in an entirely new level. So it's one of those things that when we got around to, now that we're at the time that we're at in current day, because we've been doing this for so long, the seriousness of problems we have is not as serious as what you might think. The ones that hit the media, those high level misconduct things, most of the time shock us as well. When you hear those from other agencies and you hear about these egregious misconduct cases, we kind of sit there and shake our heads and ask how those types of things can happen. We'd like to think that in Tigard, we're doing a very good job of hiring and holding people accountable for minor rules violations and making sure that people are following those as a way to make sure that we're not going to run into bigger issues in the future. So does anybody have questions about what we have here? Because I know that this should be interactive. Yeah, Patty, why don't you go ahead first?
Hi, thank you for the details. I just would like a little bit of nuance in terms of, Commander McDonald, you mentioned the collaboration between the city and the police department, and Officer Nunn mentioned that Washington County, everybody was on the same page. So could you outline a little bit the details in terms of what happened with the collaboration with the city that might not be in all of Washington County?
Well, I will say this, the agencies in Washington County are highly professional. And so as a result of that, we have a really high level of consistency. Now, that's not to be said that there aren't different things that are bigger deals at certain agencies than at others, right? Different agencies have a little bit different culture. So certain things that may be a rule violation at one agency, like a simple rule violation at one agency, may not be at another, because one agency may be more formal and another agency may be a little more informal. So that's maybe an example of some of those nuances. But when we're talking about egregious misconduct and things like that, you're going to see a high degree of consistency, not just in Washington County, but I feel confident saying that the vast majority of the state, you're going to see a high level of consistency when it comes to those. In Washington County, we had that standard even before some of the legal changes that have come into place in the last year or two. We were already there, right? What you're seeing with some of the changes that have happened in the legislature is now they're raising that bar for some of the other parts of the state that maybe weren't quite there yet. And it's creating a little bit higher level of awareness maybe in those communities. Not to say that they have misconduct problems in those areas, but what it's doing is it's creating a higher level of awareness that there is a certain standard that needs to be held, right? So I guess it's kind of difficult to give a specific example just because I don't know all of the ins and outs of every agency, but I can tell you a lot of it has to do with like rules violations, where one agency is maybe a little more rigid and formal and another agency may be a little more informal. And so what one agency may handle is, hey, a conversation, like, this is not something our community expects. Another agency, you may actually get written up and get a letter in your file for it or something like that. It wouldn't be considered disciplinary action, but that's an example of maybe a difference about how some agencies would handle more of those lower level types of things. Does that answer it, Patty?
I think so. Thank you.
Okay.
And I would just point, you asked about, our cooperation amongst each other. I think one of the big things, a big example of that is that discipline matrix that we did. We went into that process before that Senate bill even passed. Commander McDonald and I were both on the negotiation for this current contract. And within that current contract, we actually negotiated that we were going to sit down and do this. And we actually put in dates, and that was agreed upon by the city and the union that, yes, this is something we need to do. And this is when we're going to do it by. And we worked through that whole thing before this even, we were probably one of the first, I think, agencies in the state that actually did that.
Yeah, we may have been the first. It's hard to tell, but yeah, we were among the first for sure in the state to do it. Yeah. Valerie, your hand was next.
Thank you. So I guess I have two questions. And the first would be, in the situation where you had a police officer where there were allegations of maybe racially disparate application of the law. So let's say you have a patrol officer who's only pulling over Black motorists. And so a complaint is made in that situation because someone observes this. What does that process look like with respect to the union and with respect to the department? And then what is the role of each? That's my first question, is just to put a little bit more example color around what we're reading in the policy here.
Mm-hmm. So the process for something like that is first, obviously, we have to be made aware of the incident. I think it's important to recognize that of the complaints, mm-hmm. I'll use complaint as the blanket term. Of the complaints that we get, 1/3 of those are internally generated, right? Okay. We generate those basically against ourselves, right? It's an internal, whether it's something we've observed where it's a rules violation that needs to be addressed, or another member that brings the attention to a supervisor, and we generate that internally. So we receive the complaint. We evaluate, and when I say we, it's myself and Commander Rogers are the ones that receive those complaints. They can come into anyone in the department, right? Generally, they come into supervisors, first line supervisors, like our sergeants are almost always the ones that get the complaints. And it not always, but probably the vast majority go to the sergeants because they're the supervisor on duty when somebody calls in to complain. They receive the complaint. We actually have a special form they fill out. They take just some very initial information, get contact information, and then a basic description of what the allegation is. And then depending on which division, so whether it's operations or services that it falls into, that respective commander evaluates it. And then we then make the determination as to whether or not it gets assigned for investigation. So in your example, we have an officer that is only stopping minorities or African Americans, as your example was. That's probably going to be something that's generated internally, right? Maybe it's something that's brought to us by a community member, and then we do some research and look into it. We're like, wait a minute, this is a deal. We're going to look at that and make that determination as to where exactly that's going to fall. Now, chances are for something like that, that's a pretty egregious situation, right? That's going to be investigated likely by the professional standard sergeant. With very little doubt in my mind, it's going to be investigated by that person. And depending on what they find out, if in fact that is true, then we are going to refer to that pyramid. And that's going to help me to determine what my recommended discipline is. Because what happens is that if I'm the division commander, right, the investigation is done by the sergeant, mm-hmm. and they're a fact finder. They go find the facts. They then provide that to the lieutenant that's in the chain of command, that's above where that person lives. Let's say it's in patrol. It goes to one of the patrol lieutenants, the appropriate patrol lieutenant. They'll evaluate that, and then they make a determination. Is this sustained, as it may be in this case, Or what are their other observations about it? Is it not sustained? Based on all the facts of the case. It then goes to the division commander. The division commander then evaluates all of that. And if the division commander feels, yes, it is sustained, we then convene what we call a command group. So that's all the lieutenants and the 2 commanders. We get together, it's presented, the facts are presented to that group, and we all have a conversation about whether or not we feel that this is sustained. And if so, do we feel like there is an appropriate level of discipline? So it isn't done in a vacuum. Not one person is sitting there making this determination. And then, of course, the chief is kept up to speed through this entire process, right? Because she doesn't want to be blindsided by something that she's completely unaware of. It's not fair to her. This is her organization, and she's accountable for everything that we do, right? So we keep her up to speed throughout this process. And then myself or Commander Rogers are the ones that then write up what would be called the proposed discipline, right? Because all the way through this process, there's different employee rights that they're afforded. So I would, let's say it was in my division, I would then present the employee with this proposed discipline. They may get a few days to generate what they would have as potentially mitigating factors in this particular incident. They're going to get all of the information and to know what the evidence is against them. And they get a chance to go in front of the chief and talk to the chief before the chief makes a final decision on discipline. Right. If they choose to exercise that right. And I would tell you that most of the time, the vast majority of the time, if somebody is looking at something as serious as what we've talked about here, which is probably termination, right? They're going to go in front of the chief and talk to the chief and let her have some thought process to it. So that, in a nutshell, in very brief, is how the process is handled. So it isn't just one person making a decision or looking into it and then being the judge, jury, and then the one that implements the discipline. There's an incredibly thorough process that it goes through, and in many cases along the way, at any spot along the way, that can be kicked back and say, I don't have enough information to make a decision here, or I don't have enough information to make a decision here, and that would get sent back, which is part of the reason that a professional standards sergeant is so valuable, because they're way less likely to miss those check valves along the way. They're just going to hit all those because they're going to have the repetition and they have the training to be able to do those. So the investigation is much less likely to have holes in it.
So I guess I have a question about the process then. So we have the professional practices. So there's an internal or external complaint. The professional practices sergeant would investigate that. And then the union would come in to be involved in that investigation. Is that how I'm reading Addendum D? Or at what point does the union get involved?
So the union is there. Go ahead, Nick. I'll let you talk about that.
So the process is the complaint comes in, like you said, typically your patrol sergeant gets a call, somebody has a complaint. They do the intake form, they give it up the chain of command, and they determine, is this a violation? Or one I can think of right off the top of my head that a lot of people would call in and complain. When I was on traffic, it happened quite a bit. Somebody would call in and complain that we pulled somebody over, and the sergeant would typically just ask, did the officer do anything wrong? And they would say, well, no, but I just don't think I committed that violation. And those came in quite a bit on the traffic team because we pull a lot of people over. That's our job. And those type of complaints would be like, that's not a sustained complaint. You're just mad because you got pulled over. That's when you go talk to Judge O'Brien and you grieve your argument there. But the officer, a lot of times they would even say, no, the officer didn't do anything wrong. So it would come into the sergeant. They would determine if it is a violation or a possible violation and it needs to be investigated. That officer would then get served with the notice saying that, we are investigating this complaint. That is that 24-hour notice that we're talking about. So before the professional standards sergeant would interview them, they would give them a 24-hour notice. That is where we get involved because we sit in with those officers during that initial interview.
Okay.
We're not actually doing, as a union, doing an investigation. We are just sitting in those interviews with the officers. Typically, and one thing we didn't talk about, a lot of these are multiple interviews because we're not just interviewing the officer that had the alleged misconduct. We're interviewing, for example, yours about the traffic stop.
Mm-hmm.
They're probably going to go and see who else has been with that officer on traffic stops. And we're going to interview all those officers, and they're going to ask them questions. You know, when you were on traffic stops with this officer, did you see anything? And so a lot of those witness officers, we're not going to sit in on their interviews because they're just witnesses. They're not being accused of anything. We're just going to sit down on the officers that are being accused of something and sit in on those interviews. So that's really the only thing we're doing. We're not doing any of the investigation.
So does the union provide counsel for officers that are in this situation? Or, I mean, so when I read through this, I see that the officer may have an attorney present, and they may also have their union representative present. So, you know, gets a little crowded around the conference table.
We have a union attorney. He does all of our contract negotiation. Sorry about that. He would also, if it was a major, like something major that we felt as a union, if it is sustained, this officer could lose their job, then the attorney is probably usually notified, and he will sit in on the interviews as well.
Okay.
But that's only for, you know, something that we feel that the officer's likely to lose their job, then the attorney is going to come in and sit down on those.
Sure. So the union is involved then in the, you know, making sure the officer has another set of ears in these interviews, just to help listen and help them understand what's going on. And then the professional practices sergeant would make their conclusion and present that to the lieutenant, right, Commander McDonald? And then
yeah, they're a fact finder, so they're not the investigator. So if it's the professional standard sergeant, isn't going to issue a conclusion. They're just presenting the facts. Right. So they're gonna forward the facts to the lieutenant, who then the lieutenant evaluates that for to make a decision as to whether or not it's sustained or not sustained or unfounded or exonerated are the four different findings that there could be. So it would, the sergeant is the fact finder. So they're the ones conducting the complete investigation, and then it gets forwarded for a determination to the next level.
Is there a process of review of the lieutenant's determination then? Because you could, you know, I think part of the issues we've seen in the past with other departments, certainly not this department, but other departments locally and outside of our area, is that you may have one person who has a particular bias in a key role in the process that can create a lot of problems. So
yeah, that's why we do that. That's why we do that review at the command group level. If we have an allegation of misconduct, like serious misconduct, we're not talking about like a minor rules violation. If we're talking about like a serious misconduct, like your example, that information is going to be presented to the entire command team. So the lieutenants and the two commanders, and we're all going to evaluate that. So the five of us will have that conversation, and we challenge each other, right? If you were a part of those conversations, you would hear some spirited discussion where we challenge each other in some of the conclusions, or maybe we've sent investigations back because we've said, well, there's not enough information here to be able to make a conclusion here. So how could you have made this conclusion? We need this, this, and this, and we send it back, and that way it helps to insulate that ability for one person to have a bias in it. So you're having more people review it and look at it, and then it's being handled in a more of a group way where we're all having an opportunity to evaluate that work. So yeah, there would be no way for discipline to be implemented with only one person, saying, yep, this is sustained, and then going and implementing discipline, or going the other way, saying, nope, this is all on the up and up, and everything's fine.
if
Okay.
somebody was there and everybody else is like, whoa, time out. This is a serious misconduct violation. Tell me what I'm missing here, right? So
Right.
that's how we have that check valve for each other to make sure that that they're being handled in a professional manner and that we're not going to miss anything. And someone can inject bias and say, well, this is a buddy of mine. We came up together, we got hired around the same time, and I've just progressed in rank. Yeah, I'm going to throw them a bone, and I'm going to say this is not sustained. We're going to look at that as it goes through the chain of command and through the evaluation process. And some of us would go, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. We'd be scratching our heads over this. And there's checks and balances in the system to make sure that can't happen.
So the situation where something is, a complaint is not sustained would only be reviewed by a lieutenant if it's by one lieutenant, if it's a relatively minor rules violation then?
Well, it's still going to end up going to the division commander as well, and probably to the chief. So all of these things, there's check valves in place all the way along. With very few exceptions, it's going to go at least to the division commander and probably all the way to the chief in almost every circumstance, unless you're talking about one of those minor rules violations. And even then, I just gave one through to the chief here last week, was it, chief? That was a minor rules violation that the chief had to sign off on. So there's significant checks there. Chief, I know you wanted to add something.
Well, just before Jimmy and Nick get to close that loop, and let's go back to the most egregious. So before it comes to me as well, and the two commanders, and let's just say they're going to recommend termination or significant, like 40 hours, 80 hours of time off. It's going to go to HR. It's going to go to our litigation attorney. So all of this is done so it's not, everybody has eyes on it, because obviously if there was a wrongful termination, then, the attorneys have to, defend it. And so it's a pretty arduous process. And so HR and the CIS attorneys, completely removed from the whole investigation, will look at what is factually put down on paper to say, and they've said, well, I have problems, or it's a gray area, or, I would recommend X, Y, and Z. So when I get it, I should have confidence that this has been reviewed and vetted out before I make any final decision.
Just
Great, thank you.
a time check. We have 3 minutes left in this agenda item, and we still have questions from Jimmy and Nick. So
See how quick we can plow through. Jimmy, go ahead.
I'd be happy to, since time is an issue, I would be more than happy to submit my questions, and then, later on we can bring them up. I think that might, enhance the process. That's one piece. But aside from the questions I have, I think Nick's comment kind of stuck with me for a second. So my simple question is, if I was a community member stopped by a Tigard police officer, how would it be determined from my perspective if something is wrong? If I'm asked, what did the officer do wrong, if I'm not knowledgeable of police officer practices? So, I get stopped and I feel like something happened and I make a complaint. And if I'm then asked, well, what did the officer do wrong? Now, I'm John Q. Public. I'll know what y'all do. I just know I got stopped. It doesn't feel good to me. If I'm asked, what did I do wrong, or what did the officer do wrong, and I don't really know what the practices are, how can I really give a valid response that would lend itself to be pushed forward in the internal actions?
Yeah, Jimmy, so that's where your perception of the incident and the sergeant, or at very least the person that you're talking to when you're making the complaint, when you're giving that information to them, giving what your perception of the incident was and what happened from your view is what That's what we want to hear, right? That's the information that we want to gather, because your perception of an interaction with us, that our practice is the way that we operate as police, is not secret, right? When we're talking about interacting with the community, that's not secretive. That should be pretty straightforward. And so if your perception was that something went wrong, my guess is that you feel something went wrong because you're calling us, right? That's very often the case when a supervisor is getting contacted. They're the community member that's contacting us is like, something's not right here. And that's why they're calling us, whatever. And it can run the whole gamut, right?
Yeah. Okay. And thank you so much, Jamie. That's really not the point, though. I think the point is, if I am asked what is wrong, then that puts the onus on me. So perhaps in the process, the response from the department is not, what did so and so do wrong, but
so when you would be talking with a sergeant, even making that complaint, when I was a sergeant, if somebody called in to complain to me, I'd say, okay, can you explain to me what happened? I'm not going to ask you what did the officer do wrong, because that's for me to determine if the officer did something wrong, right? I need to know what happened, what you observed, and what were the circumstances around that incident. I'm not going to expect you to know what the officer did wrong. What I need to know is, what did you see? What did you hear? How did you feel about that? Because those are the types of things that are important to us.
So that point I get, and I really appreciate that. So that's you. That's you based on your experience as an officer, as a sergeant going up the chain. My thought is there a way to place in practice or policy that we're not asking what is wrong, but we're simply asking what happened? Because it would seem to me that, somebody else might say, as their leading question, okay, Mr. Brown, what happened? What was wrong? What did you see that went wrong? And I throw my hands up and say, well, I don't know if it was wrong. I just know blah, blah, blah. I'm trying to I guess I'm saying, is there a way to institutionalize that piece that allows the value judgment of wrongness to not be part of the question going into the person that is making that complaint? Does that?
It makes total sense. And I think I can clarify it for you, Jimmy, because the supervisors that we're talking about are they're all experienced investigators, right? And experienced investigators want you to tell them the story. What did you observe, right? It's not what was wrong with the situation. It's what did you observe, so that we have, oh, there you are. My screen just flashed and you went away. They're asking those types of questions, not leading questions. Tell me what your observations were, right? What was your feeling when you were dealing with the officer? Those types of things. Those are the things we want to hear. And our sergeants, that's how they're trained. Tell me what happened. And I mean, I can get a huge amount of information off of a tell me what happened. And I'd be surprised if any of our supervisors said, well, what did they do wrong? Right? So anyway, I know we're short on time, and I know we've got some more time scheduled in upcoming meetings. We can continue this part of the discussion. Nick Jarmer, did you want to hit something real quick?
No, thanks, Commander. I'll maybe wait for the next time around.
Okay.
Chief, did you have something to add?
Well, first of all, I know exactly what Jimmy's asking, and it's really is just so that assurance and isn't memorialized. Just in the profession, historically, the first line supervisor sets a tone for a complaint, whether it's, tell me about it, which is what we want, inclusiveness, and there are some who are defensive and abrupt. And Jimmy, to your point, what you're asking for is not only is it our culture, but do we have it memorialized what my expectations are of a sergeant? Am I getting that right? Yeah. Okay. And so we have expectations. Here's a perfect opportunity. We have a brand new promoted sergeant. And when we talk about going over investigations, we can set that tone. Here's a perfect opportunity to do that. And as the commander said, first of all, this is probably the most experience I have is investigations, not doing leading questions. And so I've really been teaching our department, right? Just because I just had the depth and breadth of it. So I get your point. I'll get back to you on that. And I think actually we can memorialize it even more, certainly in the training of the sergeant. So I appreciate that. With that said, I think it's my turn to present some more information.
Yep.
So this is really just building upon last week's discussion on the complaints and discipline. Of course, your charge more than anything is really that transparency and accountability, and to include whether or not it weighs in on anything you're going to discuss after that, like an oversight committee, an ombudsman, or something like that. One more step of letting you know what is currently out there, what new legislation is put in place to help guide you on what you feel may be the next steps, or if you're satisfied with what's in place. So if you will bring that up, Tammy, thank you. So now we're going at the state level. And as I've shared with you, I am now for the last year, been on the police policy committee. So I'm going to talk about this from a state level, because again, what they're trying to do is make some sort of state consistency and mandates across the entire state. So it didn't matter if you were a very small rural department in Eastern Oregon versus a metropolitan city. Next slide. And I'm going to turn my video off just so my connection is better. So again, just very quickly, historically, in 1961, Oregon created the Advisory Board on Police Standards and Training. And over the years, it has evolved to the Board on Public Safety Standards and Training. So DPSST, as we know it today, was created in 1997, and they provide the basic and ongoing training that certifies officers, monitors compliance with professional standards established by the board. The agency is guided by 26-member board on public safety and standards training. So that's the structure framework. Next slide, please. So what they're responsible for is regulating all public safety professionals in Oregon. And it really covers all professionals. You can see, it's how many they really do, from telecommuters, probation officers, to corrections officers, and so on, even to polygraphers and private investigators. Per an administrative rule, the minimum qualifications for a law enforcement officer in Oregon include meet and maintain moral fitness standards. I mean, there's many more, but I just highlighted the meet and maintain moral fitness standards because that's what my committee actually looks at. Next slide. So an action is triggered on any of these following. DPSST receives a notice of an officer's arrest or conviction. They're notified by local law enforcement that an officer has been separated from employment. They becomes aware an officer intentionally falsifies a document, dismisses a student at the basic academy, receives a public complaint, or the moral fitness standards, and they're split into two categories: mandatory violations and discretionary violations. Next. And so when you talk about mandatory, these are very severe offenses. You're convicted of a crime, a felony, or even a misdemeanor that has up to 1 year of imprisonment or more than 1 year. A drug offense, not including marijuana. Any DVs that you may be arrested for, or abuse of a child. You're labeled as a sex offender, or when officer is discharged for cause for employment. And then the discretionary, requires a judgment of DPSS staff to decide, does it Is it intentional dishonesty, misuse of authority, or misconduct? If they do believe that, then those are the cases that will get sent to the Police Policy Committee. Next slide. So the three areas we look at is under dishonesty, and you can see it's every which way you can slice on truthfulness, whether it's admission or omission, deception, misrepresentation, etc. Misuse of authority, which is intentional conduct. That includes the use of attempt of use of one's position or authority to get a benefit or detriment or harm of another. And then misconduct is what we usually see, and that you can violate criminal law or conduct that threatens or harms a person, property, or in this case, this is where a lot of chiefs do, is the efficient operation of an agency. Or, and this is the new part, it's always been there under misconduct, but this is an intentionality to call it out specifically, and that is the discriminatory conduct. And there's more verbiage to this, but this pattern of conduct, or it can be a single egregious act. And we would look at them for their certification. Next slide. So at the end of the day, the Board of Public Safety Standards ultimately makes a decision. However, each discipline, so telecommuters have their own, corrections has their own, and police, we have ours, has a policy committee. And this committee is a group of peers. It's set up by statute. And so you have a union representative, you have chiefs and sheriffs, you have a couple community members. It's a 17-member committee, and we review all the documents that an agency had on that investigation. So the entire investigation, we get to see and read and determine if we're going to decertify an individual. Next slide. So we meet quarterly. Our policy committee makes recommendation to the board for final approval. It has to be a 2/3 vote. And then the board may take that recommendation. If it doesn't get the 2/3 vote, then it doesn't even get moved up to the board. We could send a case back to the committee for additional considerations. According to DPSST, in 2020, 75 cases were presented to the board and only one was sent back. And the Police Policy Committee agenda and decisions are all on the website and accessible to the public. So not only do you get to see the agenda on whose certification we're going to review, but also you can read the minutes and see exactly how we voted, what were the aggravating or mitigating circumstances, and did the board vote for, if there was a vote to decertify, then we look at 3, 5, 10, or 3, 10, or a lifetime decertification. Next slide. So here's an example, just a snippet. And I left the officer's name on it because it's public out there. But this officer was terminated by OSP after he was found to have stated he had a bias against the LGBTQ community. The staff determined that this conduct violated the board's moral fitness standard. There was aggravating and mitigating factors that were provided. And at the end of the day, a vote by a committee was unanimous, and the committee recommended decertification for 10 years. Now, that's just to say you can't even apply for any job in the state of Oregon for 10 years, let alone would any chief even hire you after that 10 years. So that is pretty significant. And on that case, what I can tell you is, and I think, Jimmy, it goes to your question last meeting on just assurances, especially under biases. So, you know, us chiefs will talk about it and say, this totally goes against what we're trying to do and create trust between the community, especially disproportionate community members. And this is exactly what a board would want to say is, no, this person has no business being in this profession. And therefore, we're going to move to decertify the person. Next slide. Again, this is just their stats. Moral fitness standards, obviously critical to upholding the public's trust. When they fail to meet the standards, we have the authority to deny or revoke. And these are just the statistics that they have in their report on how many we reviewed over this last time period. Next. And so, you know, there's been a couple of legislative actions that bolster this even more that Justin talked about last meeting. And again, you were presented with this, so I'm just going to remind you and put it in context now. So one of the things that the legislative passed was basically, it used to be only if the officer was separated or terminated, you had to do an F4 and send it to DPSST. I can get in a lot of trouble if I don't, including criminal actions against me. So obviously I'm highly motivated, as we all are, to make sure that happens. But now they want to know anything with economic sanctions. So a day off or higher. That's completely new. And what they do is they put it on a database that we talked about. And that took effect January 1st, 2022. So this is, now you could see, you could Google it by a name, you can Google it by your department. If you typed in Tigard Police Department, you would be able to see how many were there. So it does provide access to everybody and transparency. Next slide, please. So if you went to DPSST, and that's all you have to do is type in DPSST, you would go to boards and commissions on the left side. And down under certified officer, I know it's hard to see, but it says professional, now so low I can't see it, professional standards cases database. So you would click that on, and over here is just a snapshot again of what you could see. I just grabbed one that had police, but it has corrections, it has everybody. And there's one particular one where the certification was pulled. You can click on that red to get additional information, and it'll say the date and any information. And then if you want more information, then you would do the public disclosure request. But that is what they've put for the public, is this database. So I did check myself to make sure it was up and running, and there it is. Next slide. So another House bill that was passed is, again, to prevent officers entering the workforce who may be biased or prejudiced against certain groups. It is to make sure that that's put in the background. So I'm on that work group, and we're trying to ensure that there's a standardized background checklist. So again, maybe smaller agencies, rural agencies that maybe cut corners, or I don't know, maybe it's my other brother's cousin or something like that. Again, trying to ensure that that doesn't happen, so that they ask the right questions and look in the right sites, whether it's social media access or it also requires a psychiatric and psychological evaluation to assess an officer's feeling and opinions on people of diverse cultures, races, and ethnicity. So again, it mandates that all agencies have to do these steps, which I think is huge in professionalizing our profession throughout the whole state. Next slide, please. And then the other part, the other legislative was 2930, and that's that police misconduct arbitration proceedings. Again, we talk about the role of the union and management. And so for a chief, if I decide I want to terminate somebody for cause, but somebody, the officer wants to fight it, and the union has to, support them, even if they may not agree, because they could get failure to represent. So now it goes to an arbitrator. I think across the country, one of the common things you heard under police reform is that, oh, an arbitrator overturns it and the chiefs can't get the bad apples that they want. And so Oregon has decided to put in a little bit more stringent rules as when an arbitrator cannot overrule a chief. So basically, if the facts are the facts and the facts are not in dispute, then you can't overturn a chief's decision. So that is huge. And so there's also, it creates a statewide commission on standards and conduct and discipline, and that really goes into again, those biases. And so what we don't know, they're still creating the guidelines for that, but we don't know is how does that differ from what the police policy board does now and what this commission for law enforcement standards of conduct and discipline is going to look like. By October of 2022 is when they're supposed to have their statewide uniform rules on what that process looks like. And next slide, please. And again, so they specifically call out excessive physical force or deadly force, sexual harassment, sexual assault, and then there are bias crimes, moral character, which we look at, and the use of drugs and alcohol while on duty. So those are the area they've determined. So again, how is this going to differ from what the police policy committee does versus this new commission that'll be in place at the end of the year? So stand by for information on that. And next slide, please. Okay, end the slide. So, again, when you talk about, what a chief, a sheriff, they're doing what they need to do for their organization to be a healthy culture. They have taken away, because let's say I have I think there's mitigating circumstances and I just not going to terminate somebody. And it was, I don't know, for untruthfulness. And that's great. I keep the person, but the board, because it's an untruthfulness, will now look at it and they can pull their certification. So basically, then I've got an officer who's not certified and no longer can do the essential function. So it's really having another set of eyes look at these cases and really trying to decide, are these individuals who we want in this profession? And it is probably the most eye-opening and rewarding responsibility that I've had is this last year of really having a voice as to what I believe is, either egregious misconduct or no place, or even sometimes just compassion and say, yeah, the chief or sheriff was clearly right in terminating him, but it doesn't mean that they can no longer be in this profession. What you might see is a DUI that's considered medical and there was no extenuating circumstances. They may not lose their certification. Now, that also says that a chief or sheriff may choose not to hire him, and they could be, nobody want to touch him, but at least they have their certification should they want to. So it's a lot in a few minutes, but again, I wanted to put it in context to let you know that there is oversight and it's grown over time. That's statewide. So at that, I will answer any questions you may have.
I don't see any hands. You were thorough, Chief.
Yeah, I think going back to your question, Jimmy, because it's, is again, it's that global, especially the biased, and what do we know, what do we don't know, and who's going to look at that. And everybody is recognized that this is so important, that it's the police policy board could look at this, but also that unknown commission that's going to be formed will look at these and we'll see. And the only one on there that I know of, it's by statute, will be the director of DPSST. So all these other entities will, and it probably might be already listed, but I do know the DPSSD director will have a seat at the table on that regard. But again, I think the tone and tenor has been said that, if we can clearly articulate clear biases, they have no business in this profession. And the one example that I pulled out, I was intentional because it was on the LGBTQ. And not only was the superintendent well within her right to let this person go, but unanimous across the board, both labor and chiefs and sheriffs said absolutely no business in this profession. And hopefully that gives our community a sense of there's accountability and trust beyond just a local agency.
Thank you, Chief. Oh, and we do have a hand. Justin, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Chief Alpine, for that presentation. There was one slide that caught my attention. I think it was the third or fourth one in the deck that was related to I believe it was mandatory discharge or termination. And I was wondering if that could just be pulled up again, because I didn't have enough time to write down my question, but I believe I have a question based off of what was included on that, if that's possible. Yes, thank you so much. And so I was noticing here that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are, if my understanding is correct, these are the 5 sort of offenses that would be considered mandatory for discharge. Or could you explain this a little more? I apologize. It's a Monday.
Actually, you do not have to apologize, because the majority of the ones I get are the discretionary ones for this police policy. So
Okay.
let's just say that, if you were convicted and you're going off to prison, basically the DPSST board can see that and pull your certification without it going through this police policy. It's
Okay.
not all inclusive, but these are, I guess, what I would consider deal breakers. We're not even asking the board what they think. We're pulling your certification.
Got it. And are these bylaws that are created within DPSST or in administrative rules, or are these actually in statute in ORS?
It's most of them are ORS.
Okay, got it. But you said that this is not an exhaustive list, correct?
Correct. And so the best resource that I found so DPSST just had an independent audit. So it's quite relevant because it's so new that it covers the 2020 legislative changes. And that if anybody and that goes through all accountability, but also the training and certification. This is where I pulled all the information since it was, just done. And I'm happy to send that out if anybody has interest, or you can get it on their website under their audit report.
I'm more than happy to find that myself, but if anyone else is interested, that'd be wonderful if that could be sent out. My quick question then, if you know this off the top of your head, because I know this was included somewhere further along the line that actually starts the process of reviewing with the board, was related to discriminatory practices, like you mentioned with the example with the anti-LGBTQ actions by that officer. I was wondering if hate crimes are specifically listed in ORS somewhere in relation to either the mandatory or the discretionary violations. I was just very curious about that, since I know that a handful of states, either in 2020 and 2021, started passing very stringent hate crime laws.
Yeah, and I think that, well, first of all, when you say hate crime, then you're looking at maybe a criminal investigation, right? Hate crime, as opposed to, let's say, a biased, right? Like in the example of OSP. So let's just say it's under the bias and we're looking at it. So DPSST is always under misconduct, and I think that basically the verbiage is where it hinders the department's efficiency. That's where a lot of those catch-all phrases, and so it would fall under there. But what was recently done was be very intentional by saying to include discriminatory, and then talked a little bit more about that. So even though we as practitioners said, well, that falls under misconduct, they wanted it to be so transparent and call it out to the community that they added that, but they didn't add a fourth preview. They said, oh, that really does fall under misconduct or one of these 3 categories. And so it's called out in that category. Now, the other part is they specifically say that also under this commission that they're forming. And as you saw, not only use of force or excessive use of force, and then some of the others are sexual assaults and the others, but then they also call out discriminatory practices. So I think when they define those rules, that'll be another area. And like I said, what is not clear to me is, are these competing entities? Will one eventually take over? And what is under their authority? What can they determine? Is it criminal? Is it, because DPSST is the only one that can certify. So I'm looking forward to what they come up with that they're working on right now to really explain that. So I think there's 2 avenues and areas that will call that out. And as you know more than anybody, the legislators are very intentional in making sure that they do everything that they can to weed these out, both in the hiring process and once they're hired and exhibit any concerns while they're now employed.
Got it. Thank you so much for walking me through those two distinctions. That was actually very helpful.
I think Nick Jarmer has a question. He has his hand up.
Go ahead, Nick.
Yes, thank you, Chief. That was a good presentation you just did there. I first got certified through BPSST in 1991. So I'm barely over 25 years old today. But I got a couple, I guess, observations, questions. Well, this, of course, the Senate bill wasn't there when I started, and it's there now, and it was a long time coming. And I had been an alternate member for a review board down there, DPSST, not police, but a different review board. And you're on the police review board. Where does Oregon, in your opinion, fit in with the rest of this country in doing what we've done here with this bill, and where do you think we're headed?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think two rule of thought: deeply more comparing to Washington, which is where I had the first 30 years, and how it compares. And generally, I would always say that we're kind of, Washington and Oregon are pretty close in line. But I think Oregon is farther along in. I've testified in their certification hearing, and it's a different format than what's here. It's more of an internal, small board. Doesn't have the community output and all those things that, you know. So I think Oregon is more thorough in that regards, and obviously more transparent in publishing this information. I think there's also a level of collaboration. So again, what I've seen so far in the 5 years, but really in the last 2 years under police reform, is a desire, unlike Washington, who had a lot of bad legislative pass, the law enforcement profession was not at the table. And so there is bad legislation that is hurting our community in there in regards to, you have to have an arrest, a probable cause, before you can use force. You can see where the intent was not to have excessive force, but what came out of that was, well, we don't always know for sure that we've got arrest. We might have reasonable suspicion, which we've all operated on, and I might be able to detain them, or I might deploy the dog because I got a description. Now, or let's say you have a mental ill person. An example is they saw somebody concerning who was carrying a knife and it was bloody, but they had no probable cause, so they let him go. He turned around and walked to the nearest convenience store and killed the clerk. Before we would have reasonable suspicion, we may or may not have found out that he just killed his family. And so you can imagine Washington is very trying to recover, because basically police are saying, we're not going. And so we've had nurses who deal with mental health issues walk off the job because they say, if you're not going to protect us, we're leaving. And so they've got some really concerning. I don't see that in Oregon. Being on the legislative team now, we may not always agree, but at least we're being listened to, that says, if you pass it as presented, these are the intended or unintended consequences. And is that really what you want to do? And there's a give and take. And sometimes most of the stuff we've been able to live with, per se. We may not have wanted it, but we can live with it, and it doesn't really impact negatively the community in a way that probably wasn't intended. So my hats are off to Oregon. I just saw my Chief's Police magazine that DPSST was recognized for their innovation. So across the country, they got recognition for what they're doing, and they're part of police reform. So I think Oregonians should be pleased, as progressive as they are, but a balance. And that the balance is so critical. You don't lean way far over. So I'm very happy and pleased to be part of this because I think we're making some significant changes.
Perfect. Thank you. Maybe we should send a thank you out to Eric down there at DPSSD.
Yeah, it's Jerry Granderson now. So Eric's is
Yeah.
now over on the East Coast, but you're right. I mean, but he had his footprint in this for a long time, and Jerry is, taking and running with it. But absolutely, I think they deserve some credit. And I am really impressed with how it's structured there. That I'm definitely an advocate of what Oregon has set up.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chief. And the commander, I think, has something to add.
Yeah, Chief, if I may, Nick, one of the things that I like to look back on and think about. So before police reform started within the last couple of years, Oregon, I don't know if this is a good statistic or a bad statistic, but Oregon decertified more officers as a number than the state of California did. And to put that into perspective, Oregon has fewer law enforcement officers than Los Angeles Police Department has in our entire state. So to put that into perspective, you hear Oregon holding our officers, I mean, without a doubt, to a higher level of accountability than the state of California does. So we often compare things that California is doing to what we may want to do as an example here in Oregon. And I would submit that that's probably not what we want to do in that case. So Oregon definitely holds our officers to a high standard and to a high level of accountability. So to your point, if just using California as the example, Oregon decertifies, or at least a couple of years ago, and I'd have to look at current statistics, but a couple of years ago, Oregon decertified more officers than the entire state of California did. And we have many fewer officers than California does. So as an example.
No, if I may, sorry, absolutely, Commander. That's why I'm pretty proud of what I did for a long, long time, because I've been Oregon from beginning to end. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you, Commander. Jimmy, please.
Okay, let me lower my hand. Commander, thanks for that statistic. But now that sparks my head to say, I would be interested to know if Oregon has decertified more of its officers than, say, the state of California. I would be interested in knowing where decertified officers originate from. Did they originate from the state of Oregon? Did they originate from departments other than Oregon and have come into Oregon to be officers? Because we may have a higher bar that causes us to decertify officers that have been inappropriate, which is wonderful. And at the same time, if an officer that is coming from some other state, we'll just say California, which may have looser standards or whatever, and comes to the state of Oregon, they may bring with them some of their issues, some of their biases, some of their challenges, and bring them to, we'll just say we'll bring them to the wild, wild west of Northwest Oregon. We could probably do things in Oregon that we couldn't do in California. And the reason I say that, my experience, and this was an experience that I had in my career, I met officers who had come from California who had worked with gang members, since that was part of my primary professional activity. And their manner in working with gang members was wholly different than the officers that I knew who had grown up in at least in the Portland metropolitan area. Yes, they had some different knowledges and experiences, but some of their behaviors that came into play as they dealt with those individuals that were involved in gangs pushed lots of buttons. And so, all that glitters coming out of a different state isn't necessarily gold. And some of those experiences and behaviors and knowledges sullied the waters as it related to working with specific groups of individuals in the community.
Yeah, and your point, and I imagine now that a lot of this database, it doesn't get into the weeds, but I imagine people are going to pull and extrapolate and try and find people's history and do all that. I would imagine there'll be universities that will want to study this. But I think it comes back again, just in the year that I've sat on, these are tenured people with only one agency, 20, 25 years, and they've been one that have been there for 2 years. And the 2 year one, you sit there and go, whew, how did we not see this coming, versus a 25 year that you don't know, was it always there, or is it part of the job? They changed, right? Because we all know what you see and all the negativity. And if you don't have the, healthy release, you could have been great when we hired you. And through the exposures, are a person that, is a curmudgeon and no tolerance. And so when we do laterals, which again, speaking for myself, that is a blessing and a curse. And if nothing else, you really have to vet them out. Example is we had a lateral that really didn't have anything in their background, but there was one internal affair investigation. And so we got all the details, and he was found to be out of policy, but nothing was done to him. So the way I interpreted that is there's a culture in that organization of lack of accountability or non-follow through. That's not a person that I was willing to roll the dice, and I passed. He didn't fail the background. It just was thanks, but no thanks, don't want it. So there's still that human element, right? At the end of the day, the backgrounders can do the best that they can. The chief has to decide what they want to put their stamp on. And same when we still have 5 vacancies, and I really have to play discipline to not lower my standards on anybody, because whoever replaces me down the road, they might inherit the problems. It might not come out the first year. It's usually that 5-7 year mark, and I might be long gone. And then what have I done to this organization and this culture? So there's a lot of science, a lot of, we try and regulate as much as we can and make it consistent, but there's still a lot of human good and human vulnerabilities in this process.
Just as an add-on to, your statement, Chief, I think when you and I first met, we had a really wonderful conversation, something I appreciate to this day. And one of the things that I had brought up was, we know that an officer who comes in on day 1 and an officer who is there on year 15 are not necessarily the same person they were when they came in. I know what I'm going to say is a union issue, and I'm okay with that. But somewhere, is there a thought that we bring tenured officers back in to review their, not so much their behavior, but to have discussion about where they might be in terms of the kinds of things that they have seen over the years that may impact them as a continuing officer? Again, not to move officers necessarily out of the force, but to at least acknowledge, you're going to see some traumatic things. You're going to be involved in some situations that may cause you to question, how could people do such things with children, or, with driving while, under the influence, or whatever the case may be.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so to your point, that's where this profession was very bad at taking care of their own officers, right? If you think about even before my 30 years, when I got hired on, wide-eyed, open-eyed, and I get invited to a choir practice. A choir practice was right after work. You went to the bar and they told stories. That was their way of releasing what they just saw, was drinking. And of course, they had to drive home. And through those years, they've learned, well, that's unhealthy, of course. And you've gotten into, well, EAP, but cops don't want to go to EAP, but peer support. So we have a robust peer support. And of course, you know, at Tacoma, I was the commander of that and really part of that. So it's definitely, both Jamie and I are very vested in peer support, but it's identifying what those incidences are. So there's mandatory check-ins on an incident, right? For example, the officer involved shooting, there was mandatory peer support, and then plus check-ins with a psychologist. But let's just say there was a child death, the SIDS death, those are mandatory. And so as a profession, we have tried to recognize those trigger points and mandate some conversations and to watch them. So not so much in the regulatory that I think you're getting towards, Jimmy, is, you know, like, can we mandate after 10 years a psychological again or something like that? But we try and, as the incidents are exposed, to understand them. And then there's of course this notion of early intervention systems. And so different triggers, if you beat a threshold of use of force, complaints, sick leave and things like that, the accumulation of a few things may be a result of underlying, and that would trigger not a complaint, but a review for a sergeant who may not be in tune to say, hey, is everything okay? Are you doing okay? And I've kind of noticed these, you know, you're short tempered or you're this or that. And it really was again to be early in the process so that perhaps they weren't in internal affairs fighting for their job. So it's not perfect, but this profession and police chiefs have done, you know, everything we can. Huge on resilience programs. I think we can do better. We've tried, but funding and lack of space has not allowed us to have as good as some other departments who have a workout facility in their station. To what's the best way to do when you get off shift is get out those negative endorphins, work them off. And so there's a lot of science. Even the 21st century policing really called out in a pillar is police officers' resiliency and basically their welfare. So with the end goal of one, that the statistics are staggering for officers who die of heart attack at 53. The numbers are astronomical. And so not only from a health standpoint, but also so that they're a better person when they're dealing with, when you get desensitized and you no longer have compassion for your human kind, then you're in trouble, and that's that slippery slope. And so we look to see how we can find out if somebody's headed down that path earlier rather than later.
Thank you, Chief, and others for this great conversation, but we are quickly running out of time, and we still have our agenda item to discuss our recommendation for the professional standards sergeant and ombudsman position. And for that, I'll hand it over to Kim.
Thanks, Danny. So Jimmy and I think several other PSAB members wrote a recommendation that's centered around an ombudsman. I'm gonna have to get used to saying that word pretty quickly, position. And Jimmy, I would like to invite you or someone else who was involved in the writing to give us a brief summary of your recommendation.
I'm going to pass to my friend Valerie, and then I will add any other statements that need to happen. But I do want to just initially say that I am so honored to work with such good people when it comes to crafting recommendations for the PSAB to look at. Thoughtful, transparent, caring. It just makes me feel really, really good to be able to work with the folks that stepped up and said, let's do this. So with that, Valerie, I don't mean to throw you under the bus, but Valerie had some wonderful, wonderful comments that really caused this document to flesh out. And I think the group as a whole really appreciated that.
I think this is the point where I throw Justin under the bus as well for his hard work on this document, and Patty and all the other folks who provided feedback. No, I at a very high level, we are in support, at least the folks who worked on this are in support of the professional standard sergeant position. We think it's important. We think that the value that it brings to the department and accountability within the department is critical. And I think we had paired it with a recommendation for an ombudsman position for a couple of reasons. And, from my perspective, we have the internally focused investigative aspect of it, but then we also have the, how does the public interact with the department? How does the public address concerns that they may have in facing because we've spent a lot of time on this board learning about the department and learning about how it works and how all the different aspects that go into, making this a very professional law enforcement organization. But, a lot of our fellow Tigardians and, particularly where there may be language or cultural barriers, may not have that same ability and may not have that same background. So we think we wanted to put these two pieces together because we think that it provides a pairing of accountability and also transparency that is really, at least from when I was looking at the charge for our board, is really at the core of what the city council charged this board with. So, I'm happy to discuss, and Jimmy can certainly weigh in to discuss, and all the other folks who are involved in putting this together can weigh in to discuss the, the specifics of it. But, I think at core, that's really what we were thinking. And the idea is to base it, at least pull some of the concept for the ombudsman position from the city of Portland's model. And what that may look like in Tigard may be different. And it may actually extend beyond just the police department and help navigating other departments within the city. But so I think, Jimmy, is that a fair summary of what we put together here?
I think it is. And I think it's important for folks on the board and in the public to recognize that, the PSAB is one of the first elements of the city's process in taking a look at itself and dealing with issues of equity and dealing with the issue of institutional racism. If we were just looking at the department itself, then I would feel very much supportive of just simply having the PSS and an ombudsman that focuses just within the department. However, the charge, I believe, that came from the city was that we were going to look at, the city was going to look at it through either oversight committees or review boards or something to that effect, look at how do we deal with, again, institutional racism, issues of equity across the entire structure of the city. It just so happens that PSAB is that first step that I believe that the city, notwithstanding the creation of PSAB, but is the first step of the city really taking a look at itself, its structure. And so, again, the desire to bring into the discussion the ombuds position, it really centers around a lot of our activity focuses on the internal mechanisms of the department. Wonderful. The value of transparency, the value of accountability inside the department are phenomenal. I'm John Q. Public, and I also say, well, that looks really good. But, I have this thing that might say, well, when you get behind the blue wall, is there perhaps some unintentional bias that lets the department somewhat protect its own, even in these kinds of situations. And with that in mind, where is the companion piece that the community has that allows them to say, here is a unbiased, independent voice or individual that I can speak to regarding my concerns that I might have with public works, with parks, with street maintenance, as well as with the department, the police department itself. And so,
yeah, and I think it's important to note, these two are not equally developed concepts, right? Because clearly the department has put a lot of time and a lot of thought into putting details around what the professional standard sergeant position looks like and what it costs and what's involved with it. And so, but when we were looking at the recommendation, I think the concern from those of us who are minorities is that it meets the accountability aspect of the charge, but it doesn't necessarily meet the transparency aspect of the charge. And so, we think that the two working together can have a lot of synergies that can really create a better environment and create some better optics even within the community. So that's why we have them paired within here. But the acknowledgement is that clearly the ombudsman position is something that would require a lot more discussion, a lot more thought to go into it about what that would be, what the accountability would be, and what it would cost. So
thank you both for introducing the recommendation. And I'm going to invite actually Shelby to speak for a little bit about the DEI coordinator position that the city's in the process of establishing.
Yeah, thanks. So we did talk about this briefly internally today. So one of the city's budget packages is going to, for FY23, our upcoming budget cycle, is going to include a budget request for a DEI coordinator for the city. And I think this person is going to be kind of charged with shaping some of the things that have all been discussed tonight. And so my thought is it's a little early for an ombudsman position right now. Let's let the DEI coordinator kind of play out, and that'll be playing out through the budget process. And so a job description is in the works right now, is routing through HR and city management. And then as part of the budget process, the public will have an opportunity to weigh in on all aspects of that, the job description, the budget request, roles and responsibilities. And so it seems like to help kind of develop this proposal, it might be good to kind of direct attention to the budget process and see if some of the items that there's concern about are lacking right now could be incorporated into the DEI coordinator position, because that's going to be a holistic citywide position, working with all departments, working on developing an equity lens for the city, and really kind of ramping up our citywide anti-racism policies, practices. So that's going to be in the coming months. So it feels like this is just a little ahead of its time, and that the budget process and that request might be a better venue to play this out on.
Thank you, Shelby. And Valerie, please.
So I absolutely appreciate council's position on that. I think that, we as a committee have been charged with certain specific things. And this is our response to having been charged with those specific things, which, a recommendation, obviously, with respect to this is not binding. It doesn't say that these are the things that the city has to do. I think it's our attempt to highlight some of the things that we think may be important for that DEI coordinator position. So, I don't think that the two things are mutually exclusive. I just think it's part of an ongoing conversation about how these issues should play out and, the things that we really think are important.
And Jimmy, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Joey, for the discussion on the DEI. And I'm always one to think in terms of what the public thinks about acronyms. So I'm guessing that DEI means diversity, equity, inclusion. Okay, all right. So just for public edification there. A number of jurisdictions are looking at developing DEI positions inside their organizations. And by design, many of those positions are looking at the internal operations of the organization. And to look inside of organizational policies and practices that either fail to promote or actualize policies and practices that support diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I believe, at least in the world that I look at, the ombudsman position is structurally different and significantly separate from the DEI. In fact, they probably can coexist as positions as opposed to being in inclusive piece or an incorporated piece relative to it being a position. And I know city general funds are limited as they are across every municipality. To me, this is a signature move for a organization, in this case, the city of Tigard, to say, yes, we support DEI efforts. Yes, we support police standards, sergeants positions, and in making a robust move that really orients itself from the community's lens on developing an ombudsman position. Because again, I believe that the entirety of the community, wants to be ensured that their voices are heard and or they are being listened to, and having a position that promotes, this is why we are doing this. We are doing this for you, the community, so you can feel enhanced, heard, understood, valued, and this position is what that is for. Again, different, not excluding the work that the DEI would do, because I believe every department in the city should look at its lens through a DEI kind of environment. And again, we can certainly work on crafting the language or the responsibilities, but I think at the core of this is, what does accountability, equity, social justice, fighting against institutional racism look like from the community's perspective, as opposed to what it looks like in our internal piece. Yes, keep doing the work on developing a better, stronger organization internally. And the community at large needs to have, for lack of a better description, something that they can call their piece of the organization.
Thank you, Jimmy. And I'm going to call on Nick Jarmer, and that will be our last comment on this topic for this evening. It's been a long time since we've been able to have our conversation around current topics in Tigard. So we'll be moving on to that. But go ahead, Nick.
Okay, thank you. I'll make this as fast as I possibly can here. Lower my hand. I read what Valerie, and I guess, and Jimmy, you guys put together, and I've got a few suggestions on this at another time, but I want to say that I agree with Shelby with the, newness or quickness maybe of what we're doing here. Recently, my employer had a diversity, equity, and inclusion manager, new hire within 18 months. And that has changed the organization I worked at tremendously. And big steps and side steps that no one knew was coming because of that new position. So when Shelby said that's coming, I just think that I know what our charge is here, but I think that the city and our community might want to take a little bit of a step back and see what happens with that, because it's been beneficial, but it's a huge, huge change. And I don't want us to get too far away from that. And that's all I wanted to say there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And so I did see Valerie's hand go up as soon as I said that we would be moving on from this topic. I do want to just point out there are 10 minutes remaining in the meeting, and we do have 2 more meetings around complaints and discipline where we will definitely be digging into this topic. But go ahead, Valerie.
Yeah, so my only question is, my understanding from last meeting is that the chief was going to take this recommendation on the professional standard sergeant position to city council as part of the budget process that they're undergoing now, and so wants a recommendation tonight from us on this. Is that correct?
It's coming up. We still have a little bit of time. In an ideal world, it just is, it's like an endorsement. It's kind of like the body worn camera, right? When we get your input and you think this is a good concept, it goes beyond just my thoughts. So it was kind of like icing on the cake that I wanted. And so we have some time if there needs to be a discussion, or if you want to parse it out and vote on each movement separately, and your recommendations come in separate documents. Probably easier for me if you just vote on the professional standards. If you need more time to talk and vet that out, definitely can punt it off till the next meeting. We do have some time.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we weren't putting you in a bad position.
I appreciate that a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, Valerie. And Justin.
Hi there, I apologize. My internet has been cutting out, so I'm in cellular mode. I just wanted to offer another point of view, though, in terms of a comment that was made in regards to the community taking a step back. I know for myself, in terms of my individual role as a community member that was selected to represent folks who look like me, who are of similar age and identity and background. One of the key components about the PSAT that excited folks to be involved and to elect folks to, or select folks to participate in this process, was to ensure that their ideals, even though they might not be able to be realized immediately, their ideals and their values and their lived experiences were meant to be represented through advocacy, and through advocacy through ideals such as transparency and integrity. And so that is why I would love to continue this conversation in the future. I'll end my comments here, but I just want to put that onto the record and make that known. And that is the thrust of why I participated in the creation of the Ombudsman draft.
Thank you, Justin. And yes, we will be returning back to this topic. I think it's probably our only agenda topic for our next meeting, so there'll be lots of time. And Valerie, please.
So to your current events discussion item, I just wanted to wish Tigard members who celebrate the Lunar New Year in Tet a very happy New Year. You know, it's a huge festivity in the Chinese American and Vietnamese American communities, and so I just thought it was important that we recognize that here, since we won't have a meeting before Tet.
Thank you, Valerie. Jimmy gives you a heart. Danny, I guess we are in the discussion of current events. So if anyone has anything that has struck them recently that's going on in Tigard, or anything to share?
Did you say Danny?
I did. You generally, the chair kind of leads this part, but
Oh, okay. Sorry.
no, you're fine. You've been doing great.
Yeah. Well, I guess I could share. That's something that's happened well, I guess it's about a month ago now, but at our church at St. Anthony's, our, forget the word in English, but the manger scene was lit on fire, and I saw the article, which was really, I personally really appreciated that it was being treated as a bias incident, and I think as a member of this group, and it was just kind of, it impacted me seeing what we talk about here, especially in the previous meetings when we talked about like a bias incident versus a bias crime, and those that nuanceness, seeing it reflected in like a real world event in our community. So anyways, that's just something that comes to mind for me. But I don't know if anybody else has other current events or things that are impacting our community. Chief.
Yeah, and thanks for the feedback on that, Danny. And I think you're right. You know, we've learned not to assume anything, and that things could be a bias, and we're better off coding as such, especially if anybody who is reporting it either on behalf of the church thinks it could be, we code it correctly so that it gets the attention that it needs. The other thing is again, just behind the scenes, but sharing is, you know, with the Texas incident in the Jewish community. So I reached out to one of our rabbis of our Jewish community and just said, hey, you know, we're keeping an eye. We got you. We see you, and we share information should this, you know, move to Oregon or there's any information. But just trying to reach out to you know, our communities who have been impacted, maybe not in this state, but just across the country. You know, the news comes right into our home every night, so it feels very real and personable. But just to know that we did try and reach out to make sure that they knew they had good partners in the Tigard Police Department.
Thank you, Chief.
Anybody else? Howdy.
I just want to finish on a positive note. I so appreciate being a part of this, both the Public Safety Advisory Board community and the community of Tigard. For the last number of years, the opportunities to volunteer on the Martin Luther King weekend. There's such a wonderful variety of activities, and it's just an honor and a pleasure to participate in those. So yay, Tigard.
Yeah, feel free to share a little bit more, a little bit what you did. That's great. That was venturing out in an open space, so we didn't have to worry about COVID. So we were excited to have that, host that.
I actually did not volunteer in an open space. I volunteered at the Tigard Library. And I had a marvelous experience because I volunteered with Margaret Doherty, and we are both teachers. And so while we worked together for 4 hours, we gossiped about teaching and education. And it was really quite a lovely day.
But you're connecting. Very good.
Absolutely. Masks and all.
I'll also share one other thing that's happening in the community around mental health. And I know all of us have a shared interest in this topic just because it cuts across so many other different issues. Our church was lucky enough to be given a grant from the Washington County for COVID-19 resilience-based like activities and outreach and things like that. And part of that will include mental health services and support. And I've been really excited to see internally in our community this group of young adult or Hispanic women who have really taken on this issue, acknowledging that there's a lack of resources for the Hispanic immigrant Spanish-speaking community, and just really excited that they have this resource now to be able to hopefully address some of those gaps. But they're really looking into partnering with people and other organizations in the city and also in the wider Washington County area. So if anybody, if that sparks anybody's interest and are wanting to partner with a group of Hispanic immigrant women that are trying to work on this issue and you want to provide support, do reach out.
Well, congratulations on that. That is exciting. And hopefully the city will find a place to help support it as well. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Danny.
All right. Well, if there isn't anything else, it is 6:59. Are there any outstanding items that we need to cover?
I'm just gonna put up what our schedule looks like for everybody. This familiar checkerboard. We will be spending the next meeting. Our core agenda item is working through this recommendation. We'll be back in breakout rooms and lots of conversation. So looking forward to that. And with that, Danny, I think that's it.
All right. So thanks again, everybody, for your thoughts, comments, reflections, and questions. That is the end of our meeting here. So I want to put a call for motion to adjourn.
So moved.
A second.
All right. Any further